Welcome to a question and answer episode of the Old Frontline podcast. In these bonus episodes, we'll answer the questions that you pose out of the episodes that we release each week. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast via your favourite platform, and do think about leaving us a review or a star rating. So let's get down to this week's questions. Welcome to another question and answer bonus episode, and these are proving incredibly popular. I've said this a few times, but I'm kind of staggered actually by the listening figures to them. I thought that perhaps people would listen to the old question that interested them, but it seems to have prompted kind of a whole new audience in some respects, and also a lot more reactions from people listening to these episodes, being intrigued and fascinated by both the questions and hopefully the answers too, and finding, as they're telling me, that they're going off down all kinds of different rabbit holes, and I'm kind of finding that too. And a lot of the questions are prompting ideas for future podcasts as well. So while we might kind of dip into it for a few minutes per question in episodes like this, it's making me think about some subjects that we can include in longer podcasts further down the road. So I think questions and answers are here to stay. You're sending an awful lot in, and that's really great. And some of the questions are really, really good. And you can do that through the usual methods, which are in the show notes attached to this episode, where you can send in a question via email or via the Discord server. And Buzzsprout, who are the hosts of this podcast, they're the hosting service that we pay to keep the podcast online, so it's then distributed to all the different outlets wherever you listen to your podcast. They've also introduced a feature, which again you'll see in the show notes, where you can text the podcast through the Buzzsprout website, and that comes to me on an app on my phone or on my Mac. So there's quite a few ways of you to send a question in, and there's no such thing as a silly question. Keep them flowing in, and I look forward to hearing your question at some point soon. So let's begin. Our first question of this 6th episode of questions and answers comes from Mark Weeks, who posted this on the Discord server. He says, "Hi Paul, really enjoying the Q&A format. I have a question. I'm reading Will Bird's memoir, and he mentions the fact that he's teetotal quite a bit. He also doesn't smoke. Do you have any idea how common this was? Most memoirs seem to involve a lot of booze when possible on top of rum, and smoking feels like it was constant, but I wondered what the view was. I guess it reflected society as a whole, but was Bird in the minority from your understanding?" Well, I interviewed over 350 Great War veterans, and if you think of the millions that served in the armed forces during the Great War, that was only a snapshot. But you can kind of pick out kind of common threads, commonalities in their experience. And I can think of quite a few that came from what you could describe as quite kind of Christian backgrounds. Polite families and polite society was their kind of background, rather than the rough and ready streets of one of Britain's many cities. So, for example, the Banfield brothers from Hove in Sussex. Albert Banfield, who was in the 13th Battalion along with his brother Marcus. Albert was the one that I interviewed all those years ago. Marcus died in 1918, but they both kept detailed diaries during the war, which their father typed up in the 1920s, which I've got copies of. And they came from kind of middle-class family, and they found themselves sharing bell tents with men who were from the kind of rougher corners of the county of Sussex, and they'd never smoked, they'd never drinked, and they found that kind of transition really quite difficult. And another veteran, James Leslie Lovegrove, Jimmy Lovegrove, Smiler Lovegrove, he also came from a middle-class kind of South London family. He was commissioned when he was 18. He looks like 12 in the photographs of him, very young, very naive. And he, like the Banfields, had never smoked and never drunk. But when they went into the army, they tried to keep that on. A lot of men in that period, of course, had also signed the pledge, this kind of Victorian fear of the influence and the effect of alcoholism had resulted in a kind of generation of young men in their early years of their life signing the pledge saying that they would never drink. And quite a few veterans on top of these three that I interviewed had done that. But when they were faced with the reality of military service, how long could that possibly last? For some of them, like Lovegrove, he didn't drink. He did end up smoking, but he didn't drink. Even when he was wounded and he was in pain, he kind of kept away from the drink, and he was exposed to all kinds of things that he'd never even wildly imagined in his life during his military service. And I think that's common for many young men. But then when I think of some of the veterans I interviewed who were from the north and the northeast, from cities like Newcastle or Barnsley and Sheffield and Accrington, their lives were a lot harder, perhaps a lot less smooth in those early years. And those men were much more accustomed to the idea of smoking and perhaps even drinking. And I remember Alf Rozelle once telling me, who was a Londoner who served in the Royal Fusiliers, joined up in the very early weeks of the war, went right through until he was captured at Arras in May of 1917. He always said to me, never trust a man who doesn't drink. He said, that's something I learned in the trenches. And the first time I kind of went to see him in his house, the first thing he did was offer me the whiskey bottle. And if I'd have refused that, not that I would have done, I don't think, but if I had have refused that, I think we'd have had a probably very different kind of conversation. Now, what I found with some of the men who had initially refused alcohol and cigarettes is they realised that they were commodities. So if they, as one of them did, threw his rum ration over the side of the trench, he realised that he could swap that for something that he wanted. Even though he didn't have the rum, his mate might have some writing paper or a pencil or something like that, and he'd swap the rum for that. And it was the same with cigarettes. There was a profusion of cigarettes in the trenches and out of the trenches, and I don't think men were very short of those at any point during their military service. But when we kind of think of those groups of soldiers in estaminets and dugouts and this kind of fug of cigarette smoke filling an enclosed space, we kind of think of that really very much in connection with the Great War. So I think that some men did try to carry on those principles of civilian life, but the reality of army service and the reality of the trenches made that very difficult. And you see this reflected a lot in the memoirs, and I'd refer you to some of those classic memoirs to get more of an insight into this, Mark. So I hope that's answered your question. Next up, our second question is from Alex315 or 315e. If you don't follow Alex on Twitter, you should do. He's got this fantastic Twitter account where he talks about the 315th Regiment of Infantry and his relatives' involvement in that with some amazing photographs and extracts from contemporary documents and letters. But he's posted a question that kind of ties in with what is his principal interest, which is the French side of the First World War. He says, I have very much been enjoying the Q&A format. My question relates to beyond the Somme. I have a sense that more people are wanting to venture beyond the Somme since COVID. As some have said to me, I want to see something new and learn something totally new. Is this your feeling as well? And has there been an uptick in beyond the Somme trips? Having come back from a recent trip, it was great to see new World War I museums opening on the Chemin des Dames and in Verdun. And are you, asks Alex, thinking of doing a supporters meet-up in Verdun? Well, a great question that goes very much to the heart of my really kind of original idea behind the Old Front Line, which was to tell stories not just of the Somme and Flanders, but to get to beyond those battlefields, to get people visiting the French sector of the Western Front, in inverted commas, that area, as we've now called it, beyond the Somme. And who knows, with a kind of meet-up with podcast supporters, maybe that's something for the future. But to answer your question, I think, yes, very much so, that people are fascinated by the war beyond the Somme battlefields, beyond the British and Commonwealth experience. They want to know more. There's a fear of the kind of problems of language, because I don't need to tell you, Alex, that you need to know pretty good French, pretty good German to kind of get to grips with a lot of the activities and the fighting and the war diaries and the archives connected with these battlefields to make kind of more than just a peripheral kind of understanding of what happened there. But I get the sense that people are desperate to connect with those battlefields, to understand the French war, the contribution of France, to go and find these amazing places that there are down there with trench systems and memorials and mine craters and destroyed villages and bunkers and all the other stuff that there is scattered across those hundreds of miles of the Western Front that very few English-speaking people get to. So it's great, as you say, and I saw this myself when I went to Verdun earlier this year, the new museum near to the Citadel, that's kind of a cafe, restaurant and museum all in one. That is really encouraging to see that kind of thing happening, and it kind of shows, I think, that there's definitely an uptick in visitors to places like Verdun. Chemin des Dames is not difficult to get to. I saw the Eurotunnel recently kind of promoting that as a battlefield location to visit, and that's good. And I think that all of us who kind of post about this on social media, podcast about it, we are kind of beholden, if we've got that knowledge of these places, to kind of pass it on, which I've been trying to do with this podcast, and I know that you've done, Alex, in interviews that you've done for other podcasts, and I think that's really good. And I certainly intend to return to that in the Old Front Line with some more Battlefield in a Day podcasts, looking at some of these areas in the French sector and getting to places like Lelange, which are the trenches kind of in the rock right down in the Vosges. And I'm heading down that way sometime later this year or the beginning of next, again, to kind of visit that far end of the Western Front. And I hope to come back with some material from that to spread through the podcast to get people getting down to those places and visiting these battlefields. It's important. The war just did not take place in Ypres and around Albert or Amiens, and it didn't just involve British and Australian and Canadian soldiers. It was a world war, a coalition war, and to understand that, we have to get to that ground beyond the Somme. And I would urge all of you to try and do that at some point, even if it's crossing the River Somme down into the French sector, to have a look there. It's so rewarding. It feels it's a kind of a discovery of the kind of discovery that you may have had in your early years of visiting the battlefields, because you're seeing something genuinely new. There isn't a massive amount of guidebooks about it. There are some, but just kind of driving around these places, following the signs, following the info panels, there is a lot to find. And you can just kind of turn a corner in some of these battlefields, and there's barbed wire and trench systems and the crumbling shell holes and mine craters, and you're transported back to that period of the Great War. So getting beyond the Somme is a greatly rewarding experience. And I say, do follow Alex, because he posts a lot of really interesting material and insights into this, and he's got a YouTube channel now where he's putting some films of some of these battlefields on there as well. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode. So thanks for that one, Alex. So our next question came via email from Mike Fitzgerald. Mike asks, is there a danger as we move so far away from the war that we present it as a tourist treat rather than the horror that it was? How do we present the horror to the young today? Siegfried Sassoon's poem about the Men in Gate comes to mind, and he quotes, "Paid with a pile of peace-complacent stone." Well, Sassoon was very bitter about the war. I mean, this is a great question, Mike. Sassoon was very bitter about the war. He was a man haunted by the war, haunted by the imagery of the war and the things that he'd seen, and in many cases some of the things that he'd done. And he looked at the kind of sacrifice that had been made and asked again and again, was it in vain? Was it for nothing? And he saw memorials like the Men in Gate as a way of kind of dressing up the kind of glorious dead in something that they weren't. He could only see the horror. And I think that operates on one level. Men who were there knew what that horror was. Sassoon and millions of other soldiers that were on the front line saw that horror, felt that horror, experienced, even tasted that horror. The smell and the taste of battle is something that can't really be underestimated, I think. And they came back from it with a very different viewpoint. But did they really want the families to think that way too? Who are the memorials for? Are they for the veterans, or are they for the families of those who died? And I think it's the same with the cemeteries. The cemeteries are incredibly beautiful places, those silent cities, the white splash of stone, the English garden effect. It kind of takes the horror out of the equation, removes it. And for people like Sassoon, and I think many others, not all of the veterans of the Great War, that was something that didn't always sit well with them. But again, kind of thinking of the families, was that really for them? And I'll give you a kind of example of this, mentioning one of the veterans that I spoke about in one of the previous questions in this episode, and that's Jimmy Lovegrove. He was an officer in the 2nd 4th South Lancs. As I mentioned, he came from quite a Christian background. He had very strong beliefs that he carried throughout his life. And one of the things that he said that troubled him was when men were killed, he kind of had to lie about how they died. So a soldier would be killed, often in horrific circumstances, and he'd have to write a letter to the parents as the platoon commander saying that this soldier had been shot through the heart, died at once, suffered no pain. And if you read newspaper obituaries of soldiers in the Great War, that is a phrase that you often see in those reports. And he kept doing this, and it troubled him. And then one day he decided that he was going to tell the truth next time. And a soldier got hit, died in terrible, horrific, terrible circumstances. And he started to write this out in his notebook. He paused and read back over it and thought, I can't send that to the family. So he tore it out, screwed it up, threw it into the corner of the dugout and wrote, "Dear Mrs. Smith, your son was shot through the heart, killed at once, suffered no pain, beloved by all his comrades." So there is that kind of acceptance that the truth perhaps could never be told. And some of the memorials kind of belie the truth of the war in the way that they're presented. And I think that your kind of wider point as we move into this 110th anniversary of the First World War this year, how do we present this war to new generations? We can't sanitize it, particularly as war and conflict is now very much part of our modern world, and conflict is taking place on European soil once again. And it's important to tell the truth, particularly to younger generations. When I've done school groups, I've often not been gory with them, but I've kind of been truthful that how terrible it was for these men and the kind of things that they might have seen and experienced, and that these are things that we have to think about when we travel around these battlefields. And those pathways of the old front line should never be presented as some kind of cheap tourist trap. It's far more than that, and I don't ever really see that happening. There's been kind of tourist tack during the centenary in shops and things like that, but on the actual ground itself, I don't see it being presented in that way. It's not always presented right. We can think of some memorials that we may like or dislike, but I think that generally we see quite a good approach to the battlefields. We let the battlefields speak. I say to prospective battlefield guides, the battlefields themselves, the lanes, the woods, the fields, the pathways, everything else that is part of that landscape of the Great War, it's your toolkit. It's the way that you can tell stories of the Great War. Use it. Use that toolkit. Take it on board. Embrace it for what it is. It's a powerful witness, the last witness of the Great War, because beneath that landscape, it's still telling its stories. And that's a power in its own right. And what I find with new generations of people coming into this, and with adults as well, is that they react very, very favourably to objects, object-based learning, where you take a group of people and you show them a group of objects connected to a soldier's experience or a particular part of a battlefield, helmets and bayonets and personal items that are found. They react to that very, very strongly and positively, and they take a lot away from it. So I think that is part of the kind of educational route, that it's the landscape, what is beneath that landscape, and museums and collections on those battlefields, on that landscape, I think have a great part to play. So while we can get kind of lost in the bitterness of people like Sassoon, and he was bitter throughout his life, and understandably so, because some of the best people he knew, like Dick Tiltwood, David Thomas, killed on the Somme, and his great friend Wilfred Owen, killed in that last moment, that last ember of the First World War in November 1918. Sassoon, as well, he was this strange kind of contradiction. One of the accounts says he was both, at the same time, the best company commander on the Western Front and Britain's greatest pacifist. All words to that effect. So, like I say, we can get lost in Sassoon's words, and they're important. They're part of that vocabulary of the First World War. But I think to truly present the battlefields as they are, we need to embrace that landscape, understand that landscape, and make sure that future generations have that landscape to explore and understand this subject, and that it never becomes a place where just tourists go. And I'd certainly be interested to hear all of your thoughts about that if you want to leave some comments on the podcast website about this question, which I think is a really great one. So thank you, Mike. Our fourth and final question for this episode comes from Matt on Discord, and he asks, my question relates to the identity tags, their adoption, use and development in the Great War. How did soldiers feel about wearing them, or not at times, as I believe that sometimes they were ordered to be removed during trench raids. Also was their use and development similar across the armies of the participating nations. I think what is behind my question is the shocking fact that so many of the dead were unidentifiable, even by regiment or nationality, although I try to appreciate the effects of artillery fire on battlefield burials would have been, or the fact that some dead lay unburied for months. Well, Matt, you kind of hint at a great problem with the British and Commonwealth experience of the Great War, and indeed an experience replicated by the Germans and the French army and their colonial soldiers when all of these battles were fought. And if you look at pretty much every battlefield of the Western Front, then at least 50% of the dead, no matter what side, no matter what army, no matter what nation, at least 50% of the dead are either unidentified or unidentifiable and don't have a known grave. It's particularly noticeable with the British and Commonwealth soldiers because we built memorials to the missing that commemorated those men who did not have a known grave. The French never did that. They have memorial chapels on some of their key battlefields that commemorate the dead, and that was done by public subscription. The Germans were never in a position to do this, so we can't really easily visually quantify the scale of missing for those nations in the same way that we can with Britain and the Commonwealth. But coming back to the essential part of your question, which is about identity tags, or dog tags as they're often called, identity disc was the phrase used in the First World War. Soldiers went to war in 1914 with an identity disc, and they were issued in the Edwardian period, in the Boer War. Some soldiers had had them. Many men had just had a piece of card with their details on a piece of paper that was tucked in their tunic pocket. So if you were a soldier that got shot through the chest and all of that part of your uniform was covered in your blood, then that bit of card with your name and details on would have been pretty much unreadable under those circumstances. So this led to the adoption of the use of identity discs, which was, in terms of the British experience, a circular disc that was worn on a bit of bootlace around the neck. And these were only normally, from what I can gather, they weren't worn in peacetime. So when you were in barracks before the war, or if you were a territorial soldier, you weren't issued with one. You didn't wear them then. But when war was declared and units were mobilised, the tags were issued. I would guess one of the quartermasters with a set of stamps would get these discs blank and then mark them up with the details of the men from the unit's nominal roll. And on those discs it would have the soldier's number, his rank, his initials, his surname, his religion normally in the centre of the disc, CE for Church of England being the most common, but obviously many other religions were inscribed on those discs as well, and then the unit. And the unit often was quite detailed. So I've got identity discs where it just says Royal Sussex Regiment, but then I've got others where it says their battalion, sometimes their company, and even their platoon. And in terms of core units like artillery and engineers and Army Service Corps, it often gives the precise unit. 125 Motor Transport Company, or 183 Brigade Royal Field Artillery, or 156 Field Company Royal Engineers, or whatever it is. So there's quite a lot of information on these tags. And that single disc, which was a red disc, some units that served in hot climates had metal ones. I think it was called a 1906 pattern disc, where it was a metal circular disc made of aluminium, and that was worn by a bit of cord around the neck. And you see a lot of those at Gallipoli. I mean, I've seen a lot of private collections at Gallipoli where they've found a lot of these metal discs in the kind of scrubby soil and sand of the Gallipoli battlefields. But both of those types of discs were then eventually used on the Western Front as well, the red one being the most common one. And when a soldier was killed and he was laid to rest, when he could be buried given the circumstances of battle, the tag was removed and handed in to an officer as a kind of proof of death. But it meant that you were burying a soldier with nothing on him. So if that grave was subsequently destroyed, the marker on it, the cross, the rifle stuck in the ground, whatever it was, if that was destroyed and that grave marker was lost, there was nothing now on that body to say who that soldier was. And when it came to the period after the war and the battlefields were searched, many thousands of bodies were found and there was nothing on them to say who these men were. Sometimes a brass shoulder title to identify a regiment, and you see this expressed on unknown soldiers of the London Regiment, for example, or unknown soldiers of the York and Lancaster Regiment, whatever it is. And sometimes a rank, so you often see an unknown lieutenant or an unknown sergeant, but there was not enough information to identify the man himself. So this led Fabian Ware, who was one of the leading lights in the War Graves Commission, put forward this idea of a 2-tag system where there would be the red one and a green octagonal tag, so in the dark you could feel the difference between them. And soldiers were told, one veteran told me that you were told this phrase, red blood remove, green putrefaction leave. So you remove the red one, handed that in, and the green one stayed with the body. But it was made out of this kind of fibrous material that was said to be indestructible, but was proved not to be indestructible. So again, when they exhumed bodies after the war, they found that the decomposition of the body had often decomposed the identity disc as well, and it was just mush. There was nothing to read and no information you could get from it. It could also be that men who were charged with finding these bodies after the war didn't like the idea of putting their hands into rotting body cavities looking for identity discs, and perhaps you might do that once or 10 times a day. Would you do it 100 times a day? I don't know. But I think that is an element in this story as well. Some soldiers bought their own identity discs, metal ones that they wore on a chain around their wrist. Sometimes they wore them on both wrists, and I've even heard of soldiers wearing them on both wrists and around their ankles, with the idea if they took a direct hit, their arms and legs would blow off, and at least there'd be something with a name on for their comrades to bury. This was the kind of grim reality of experienced soldiers who'd seen what happened to bodies, as you've suggested in your question, that were left lying on the battlefields. They would become part of those battlefields. So the British use of these identity discs was kind of a bit ad hoc and hit and miss, and even when they had the 2-tag system, often they would remove both, hand the red one in, and then tie the green one to the grave marker that then could be destroyed by shell fire or the circumstances of war. And this is one of the principal reasons, I think, why so many soldiers do not have a known grave. In the French army, they wore a metal tag that was worn around the wrist, and in the German army, they had a whole variety of identity discs with big oval ones with information about the soldier repeated on 2 halves. So when a soldier was killed, they broke the tag in half, handed one half in, and the other half stayed with the body. And what that means is that because most German tags were metal-based in their design, then when a German soldier from the Great War is found, there's a much higher chance of identification. And if I look at some of the battlefields where I've witnessed archaeology myself, very many of the identified soldiers that have come out of those battlefields have either been French or German because their identity discs are made of metal and they survive much better in the ground. So again, I kind of think really that going back to the very beginning of this Q&A podcast, where I spoke about how some of these questions prompts entire episodes, and I think the whole kind of use and the adoption of identity discs and the way they were used, and in some battles how men had to hand their discs in before they went over the top, and that was true with trench raids and so on. All of these kind of reasons led to the myriad of complex reasons why soldiers do not have known graves. And that is a kind of fascinating subject in its own right. We've touched on it a little bit in previous podcasts, but maybe it's time to return to that, and maybe we'll return to the whole subject of identity discs in a future episode. And they are still very much part of those turning pages, forever turning pages of the Great War that we frequently speak about in this podcast, because I have found identity discs myself on the battlefields to soldiers who were killed, which has led to a search in that area for any human remains. In all cases, sadly, nothing had been found, but it just shows how, again, that landscape of the First World War is still giving up its secrets. The eternal fascination, really, certainly for me, of the old front line. So I hope that's answered that question, and like I say, I'm sure we will return to it. So thanks again for some amazing questions and some really good ones in this episode. We've got some more coming up soon, so stay tuned for these bonus episodes with your questions and answers related to Great War history. See you again soon. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com